Hey everyone, Zach here from Windows Central and welcome back to another video. Now today we're taking a look at Microsoft's new handheld gaming mode for Windows 11 running on an original ASUS ROG Ally. So Microsoft has already announced this experience coming to the Xbox Ally and Xbox Ally X first, but it's also going to roll out to all Windows handhelds, and today we're taking a look at it running on the original ROG Ally. And you'll find that the experience is basically identical. We get everything from the full screen Xbox app experience to the new multitasking switcher here, like you can see here, which makes moving between apps and games incredibly easy. The entire system, more or less in this mode, is accessible with a gamepad now. So if I want to get to all of my installed games, I can do that through the My Library screen here. And this library now also shows you games from other storefronts, not just Xbox games. So I can see my games from Steam here, the Epic Games Store, and the GOG launcher, in addition to the Microsoft Store. You can also see installed apps and storefronts here. So you can see we have a number of different gaming related apps as well as the Microsoft Edge app, and everything runs in full screen in this mode. So if I hit on Microsoft Edge, for example, you'll see that the Edge browser now launches in a full screen view. And if I try to cascade the window or minimize it, it doesn't do anything. Everything runs in full screen in this mode, or does its best to run in full screen. And that makes the most sense on a small screen like this, especially one where the primary input method is controller. I can close the app by going into the multitasking view and pressing the X button, and that will take us back to the Xbox app, which replaces the desktop interface. So things like the taskbar and start menu aren't loaded in when running in this mode. You can get back to the traditional desktop interface, but by default, or at least if you set it to run in this mode, those elements will not load in. And that, in theory, is supposed to free up some system resources, which should make launching games and perhaps even running them a little bit smoother. There are a handful of settings to go through. If we go into the settings area here, you can see we can configure / enable and disable the handheld gaming mode by going into this screen here and turning this option off. We can also change the home app. So by default, of course, it's the Xbox app, but perhaps in the future, maybe third-party storefronts could also choose to replace the desktop interface with their own shell. Perhaps, Steam Big Picture mode, for example. That's just a theory, but as of right now, the only option here is the Xbox app. And also, if we go into the apps area here and scroll down to startup, you'll see that there's a new option for only starting apps when entering into the desktop mode. So by default, the full screen Xbox mode just disables all of your startup apps, or most of your startup apps. Everything you can see here is now set to only load up once I enter the desktop mode. And that in itself also frees up a lot of system resources. You can, of course, change that. So if I wanted something to start even when running in the full screen mode, I can set it to do so. But by default, this mode will disable most of your startup apps, and that is designed to free up RAM and CPU resources. So to show you what this looks like, let's take a look at what we have currently running here in our background processes. We have 69 nice background processes. If we go into performance here, you'll see that we're using around 40% of our memory and currently only 2% sitting at idle of our CPU. So if we go in here and launch the Windows desktop, you'll see that because of how my apps are configured to start up, we're going to see a lot more system utilization going on as we move into this mode. So we hit here and hit OK. You'll see that our background processes are already increasing. 78, 81, 84, 81. And as things load in, of course, we're going to be using more RAM as well. So we're now using 54% of our RAM, and CPU is now up to around 30%. 46 there. And so, yeah, as things load in, of course, we're going to see a lot more system resources, but let's let things calm down and see where we sort of sit after that. Okay, so the system is now running at idle with all of our, startup apps running in the background. And you can see we're now running around 96 background processes. And if we come over to our performance tab here, you can see that our CPU usage has now settled down, but our memory usage is significantly higher than it was a minute ago. It's now running at around 61%. And that's with me not doing anything. And so that is where the sort of performance gains really come from. The fact that by default, Windows will disable all of that from running when you run in the full screen mode. So we'll show you how that impacts gaming performance towards the end of the video. But for now, let's move back into the full screen mode, and we can do that through the task view here. We can just press that, and that will allow us to go back into full screen mode. And you get a pop-up here that says, choose how you'd like the full screen experience to run. And Microsoft recommends actually restarting your device when re-entering into full screen mode, because that allows Windows to unload things like the taskbar as well as all of your startup apps. But you don't have to do that. You can enable that optimization. But in this case, let's restart. So let's load up a game and show you how that works. We'll start with a Microsoft Store game because that's easily the sort of most fluid experience you're going to see in this mode. We'll start with Doom: The Dark Ages. If we hit play here, you'll see that the game basically loads like it would on a console. We get a brief splash screen as the game loads in, and then the game is running. There's no additional launchers or storefronts that want to pop up because this is a Microsoft Store game. And so the sort of getting into the game experience is already very streamlined. So here we are in the game, and at any point I can press and hold the Xbox button to get access to our multitasking switcher, which allows me to move between my open apps and games. From here I can launch another game. So let's launch Minecraft. Of course, this isn't recommended. Even Windows will say, yeah, you should probably quit the game you're currently running. But if you really wanted to run 2 games at once and you had a system powerful enough to do it, you could do it, and it works really well. And switching between the running games using this new interface is very fluid, and it's much faster than using the old desktop/taskbar interface, because using that with a gamepad is basically impossible. But now you can just go like this and switch between Minecraft and Doom on the fly, which is really quite cool. We can close out of those games very easily like so. Now, not all games will be as fluid as that. Some games will require an additional launcher, such as Shadow of the Tomb Raider here. If we launch Shadow of the Tomb Raider, you'll see we do get a splash screen, but then there will be an additional menu that pops up, which unfortunately doesn't take controller input. We have to use the touchscreen here to tap play, but that will then load us into the game, and we should be able to get on with raiding some tombs. So here we are in the game, and as always, we can access the game bar at any point by pressing the Xbox button. I have programmed this to be the Xbox button by default. I don't believe it was, but I've programmed it for a single tap to be the game bar and a tap and hold to be the multitasking switcher, like so. So at any point we can just go home using the game bar or go straight into our library, and we can also close out the game through here as well. And down here we can even launch our other storefronts. So if you have multiple storefronts installed, you can get to them quickly through the game bar like so. Now let's take a look at what the experience is like when launching a game from a third-party store. Now this will depend on the game. Some games are more egregious than others when it comes to their own launchers and storefronts. But let's try Steam, for example. This is GTA 5, and because we're running in this mode, Steam is set to not run at startup at this point, and this will be the first Steam game I launch, and so this will have to load up Steam in the background in addition to the Rockstar launcher and then GTA 5, and so that's going to take a little bit longer than usual. You can set Steam to run at startup if you really want, and that will streamline this process somewhat, but yeah, by default, with everything being disabled, it does take a little bit longer to get a third-party game running if it requires a storefront to open first. So if I hit play here, you'll see that Steam wants to check for updates and begin loading in first. This should only take a couple of seconds, ideally, assuming my internet's fast enough. There we go, and we get all the usual Steam pop-ups, but Windows is doing its best to sort of streamline the experience, so you don't actually have to press any buttons at this point. Windows is just going to hide everything for you and make sure the game is the priority. So the game will take up the full screen, of course, and all of the apps will be sort of pushed to the side in the background. And there we are now running in GTA 5. And if you press and hold the multitasking button, you can see all of those app windows are still running in the background. So if I wanted to switch into Steam, I could. But you can also quickly close them out like so once the game is running. And although those services will still be running in the background, they'll no longer be cluttering up the multitasking view. All right, here we are in GTA 5. And as always, we can get back to our launcher just by pressing on the home button in the game bar. Now, you can hide games from third-party storefronts if you want. So if we go up to the settings area of the Xbox app, if you don't want to see things like Steam games or Epic Games Store games here, you can go down to Library and Extensions, and you can turn on and off the games from a particular storefront straight through this interface. Now, with the game bar, you can do things like jump into Windows settings, as well as restart the system. So we have all of our power and network settings down here. So you don't have to enter the desktop mode to get access to all of that. You can now do it straight through the game bar interface with a gamepad. And if we go into here, we can also open the Windows settings app through that interface as well if you need to go in and customize something like the display or update your system, which is still a thing. In this mode, Windows Update isn't disabled because, Microsoft still wants you to update Windows. And so Windows Update can still do its thing in the background while you're gaming. So from here, I'm going to quickly restart the system and load back in. And then I want to do a direct performance comparison between a game running in full screen mode and a game running in desktop mode with all of those startup apps enabled, just to see how things change. So let's get into our power menu here and hit the restart button, and we will be back in a second. So here we are, we're back into the system. I've taken out the charger because I want this to be running on battery for the sort of most realistic performance benchmark here. We have nothing running in the background. If we go to our game library here and go to let's do Tomb Raider. Let's do Shadow of the Tomb Raider and see what the benchmark pulls in this full screen mode. Now, keep in mind, this is with all of my startup apps set as disabled. That is the default behavior for this mode. If you were to have multiple things running at startup, that would obviously alter the performance benchmark here. But by default in this mode, everything's set to be disabled. And so that's what we're going to test here. So if we go into options and go down to display and graphics, I believe we have a benchmark option in here. We do. So let's do that. And we'll show you the result at the end. So we've run the benchmark and we have an average FPS of around 38. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to load into the desktop interface and run the benchmark again. So if we press and hold the launcher here and go down to the Windows desktop option, you'll see we have the option to exit into desktop. Let's do that. And now things like the taskbar are loading in. And as you can see, all of our startup apps are now loading in, which means we're going to have less system resources available to us. Okay, let's run the benchmark again and see our result. So here we are back from the benchmark, running in the traditional desktop mode with all of our startup apps enabled as normal. And as you can see, yes, we do have a worse result, an average FPS of 29. So almost 10 FPS difference there. But this is a worst case scenario, of course. I've just left the defaults as is. If you were looking to optimize, most handheld gamers are already likely optimizing the apps that run at startup on their devices anyway. And so I'm going to run the test a third time, this time in the desktop mode with all of my startup apps disabled, to see if there is a performance difference between the handheld mode and the desktop mode when no startup apps are affecting things. So here we are back in the system. Let's move over to the settings app here to go into our startup settings and make sure that we have everything set to disabled. So if we go to startup here and we'll go through and make sure everything is off. Okay, now everything is set to off. I should be able to enter into the desktop mode and have none of my startup apps appear, like so. Okay, and now let's launch Tomb Raider and see if we get a better result. So here we are, we're back from the benchmark, and as you can see, an average FPS of 38, which is identical to the benchmark we ran originally in the full screen mode. So that's proof that the performance gains you're going to see likely come from the fact that when in full screen mode, Microsoft disables all of your startup apps. That is a huge draw on the system on Windows, and so disabling all of that does improve things twofold. But if you're somebody who is already disabling all of your startup apps on Windows on your handheld device, you likely won't see much of a performance increase between handheld mode and Windows desktop mode. They more or less behave the same. The only things that aren't loaded in full screen mode are things like the start menu and taskbar, but those are so minor that they don't really impact system performance. It's all of the other startup apps that usually eat into RAM and CPU. So with all of that disabled, yes, of course, you see a better performance result. So this is Doom the Dark Ages, and as you can see, it's the same story here. This is full screen mode, and this is desktop mode with no startup apps enabled, and the difference is negligible. I think you're really only going to notice performance gains when you have startup apps enabled in desktop mode. If you're somebody who's already configuring that to make it so nothing starts on your handheld, then the performance gains you're going to see here will be very minor, if non-existent. So yeah, I think the performance improvements that Microsoft are touting really do just come from the startup apps. I'm guessing that on paper, the taskbar and start menu not loading in full screen mode does give you slightly more system resources, but it's not by much. And in gameplay, you're likely not going to notice a difference. Now, of course, this will depend on the game you're running. Some games do require things like Steam and their own launcher to be running in the background, and that will affect things. That will make performance better or worse. And so, yeah, it really will just depend on the kind of game you're running and how you have your startup apps configured. If you have nothing set to run, performance should be about the same, I think. If you do have lots of things running at startup when you enter into desktop mode, then yes, gaming will run better in full screen mode, because in that mode, by default, everything is set to disabled. So there we are. That is a more in-depth look at Microsoft's new handheld gaming mode for Windows 11. The UI changes, the interface is great. It makes using these handheld devices running Windows easier and more intuitive. I can get to all of my installed games regardless of where they came from, and I can multitask between open apps and games with ease. On the flip side, the performance gains that Microsoft are touting are very minor, if non-existent, depending on your setup. If you are somebody who's already using a handheld with lots of startup apps, then yes, you likely will see a performance increase when using the handheld gaming mode. But if you're already somebody curating your startup apps list in desktop mode, you may not see a performance increase at all. And so it really will just come down to how you're already treating your device. With that, thank you so much for watching, and we shall see you in the next one. Bye-bye.